I'd like to call the Wednesday, August 6th, 2014 MetroVision's Issues Committee meeting to order. And let me start by welcoming our newest member. Ashley Stolzman is replacing Hank Dalton from Louisville. And yay. And I believe you're replacing him as the DRCOG member, and as you've also requested to be on MVIC.
That's correct.
You are just doing it all. So MVIC, the new MVIC appointments will be made at the next DRCOG meeting by our illustrious chair, who is somewhere. But you'll get to sit down here with the rest of us next meeting.
I look forward to that.
And we also have another special guest with us, and I'll turn it over to our esteemed Mayor Tisdale to do the introduction.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. For the sake of those of you who were not able to join us for the luncheon that we had at 1 o'clock, we do have a very special guest with us. Some of you are familiar with the Denver region, Baghdad region partnership that we have. It is one of the only sister cities international partnerships between cities or regions that exists on a regional basis. And we have with us today one of the representatives of the Baghdad regional government and the Baghdad regional partnership. Joe Rice, former officer of DRCOG and former mayor of Glendale and former state rep, and he's former all kinds of things. He was sort of the founding father of the Denver region, Baghdad region partnership, and Joe is with her, but I would like to introduce to all of you from Baghdad, Iraq, Aisha Al-Hadi. Aisha, if you would. Aisha has participated in the Sister Cities International Conference in San Jose last week. Is now in Denver, has been here for 3 days. She goes on to Missouri, and we'll see some folks from Missouri, and then goes on to Washington, D.C. So she will have done a coast-to-coast journey and will be able to report back to Iraq as she has reported here to us about Iraq.
Thank you for that, Doug. And let's make sure our meeting is as exciting as it can be. We don't want her to get bored. And civil. We'll go for civil and exciting. All right, I'd like to open the meeting up for public comment. If anybody in the audience would like to come speak to us for 3 minutes about an item for which a prior public hearing has not been held before us, now is your opportunity to do so. Do we have any takers? Seeing no one, I'll close the public comment period and turn your attention to the summary of our July 2nd meeting. Did anybody see anything that might need correction or editing in that?
Move to accept the minutes.
We don't actually have to,
okay.
But thanks for the enthusiasm. All right, so moving on then, let's move to our action items. We only have 2 tonight, which gives the impression that this could be a light meeting, but I'm sure we'll use our full time knowing us. So the first item is giving staff direction on the criteria to be used for the second phase of the TIP. And I just want to emphasize before staff start their presentation that we will not be making any final decisions tonight. We're going to be giving staff direction, so after the presentation, we'll take ideas of criteria to be used, and maybe we'll straw poll them if we have too many, that we want staff to take back, explore, and provide us more information on. Yes, and Jackie?
While staff presentation is going around, there's a card circulating for Jennifer. If you guys, anybody who's interested in signing it, please sign it, and I want to let you know that the board officers are sending her flowers on behalf of the board. She's having her surgery today, and hopefully we'll hear good news. But just, you'll see a card circulating. Please make sure you sign it before you go. Sorry, Lisa.
No, thanks for doing that.
Great, yes,
So-
thank you very much. Appreciate everyone keeping Jennifer in their thoughts and prayers. Madam Chairman, thank you very much for the introduction to this, and it is correct. We are simply going to initiate the discussion on second phase criteria today, and just have an open dialogue about what your expectations are with second phase, and actually, you know, lean on you to give us some of your feedback on what you think certain criteria or guiding principles we should take back to research for your consideration at hopefully next meeting or October's meeting. Everybody's seen this flow chart before, and you know, I think it's we all just thought we were done with the TIP criteria, of course, but we're now to a point where we're dealing with the second phase portion of our selection criteria, and the second phase criteria represents 25% of the remaining yet-to-be program funds are to be allocated. I might point out that, just so everybody knows, I know we have a new member, that our TIP process is done, the selection of process is part of our call for projects. Oh, and I should coincidentally say that the call for projects did go out last Monday, July 28th, so if you're not aware of that, you might want to make sure that your staff contact knows that it's out there, but we'll be following up with them for sure. That we do it in two phases. The first phase, 75% of the available money is allocated in this phase, and the projects are selected based on the score, based on scoring criteria, and they compete against like projects. So capacity projects compete against capacity projects. Bike ped competes against bike ped projects. And then once that's done, the projects that are not selected in phase one, those projects then in bulk go to a second phase pot. And under second phase, the way those projects are selected, there's more discretion given to the to MVIC/board in how ultimately those projects are selected. Their projects are not scored per se, but there are some guiding principles or guiding attributes which are used to come up finally with a recommendation and final approval. And last time there were 5 elements that were considered, or 5 attributes. The project score was certainly one, financial equity, strategic corridors, very small communities, and greenhouse gas emission reduction. And I'll just real quickly hit on each of those, just so everybody's up to speed and so we all know what we're talking about here. The financial equity portion of this was really, the purpose of it was to provide information so we can compare the total project expenditures within a county versus how much money that county contributes to the overall cash whatever within the county. So it's basically it's a formula that dictates this is how much investment was in your county versus how much money was paid in, let's say. And last time the expenditures were based, the expenditure side of that equation was based on the projects that were in the TIP from DRCOG, CDOT, and RTD TIP projects were all included on that side. And on the contribution side, the 3 criteria that was used was population, VMT, and something that was called transportation-related sales tax revenues. And you can see the percentages of how that was proportionally based in the calculation. The transportation sales tax revenues was, it's something that, quite frankly, staff is, we've, in scrutinizing exactly the latest iteration of this number, we have some trepidation about the accuracy of that number. So it's something I think we'll want to have a discussion about with you all as we go forth with deciding exactly what should be on that contribution side. We think there could be other mechanisms that are probably a more accurate representation of what we're trying to get at with this transportation-related sales tax. Very small communities. This is one that's been a attribute for several TIP cycles, but we did change the definition this last time. We had in the old TIP, the very small communities were defined as anything less than 12,500 in population or employment, and we changed that definition this time, and actually I think it was actually Jackie Millay that raised the issue that we have some communities that, although in population and employment they may be small, they're their ability to pay for projects or to finance projects are probably greater than maybe some others. So a better mechanism to look at was one in which what is, how much money they have available to them. And so what we decided on, and this was actually discussed at an earlier board meeting back in February-ish, that the new definition is anything, some very small communities now defined as anything less than $10 million in annual net sales tax, based on the most recent Department of Revenue statistics. And as a result, and we do feel that this better reflects the intent of this category. And as a result of this definition change, 2 communities were moved out of this category, Glendale and Lone Tree, and 2 communities were moved in, Area and Lafayette. Strategic corridors and greenhouse gas emissions. I put these on the same slide because they're kind of in a similar situation. On the strategic corridors, we all recall that part of our discussion is in first phase, part of the Metro Vision criteria, we had a discussion about whether to include strategic corridors as a, as a potential criterion. And it was ultimately decided to remove from consideration strategic corridors. So, it's open, of course, to you, based on your ultimate determination if you want to continue that, or I guess you still could consider it in second phase. Reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and the issue with this one is that in the past, VMT estimates were required for certain project types, which is not the case anymore in first phase. So we don't get that actual VMT reduction calculation from our member local governments. And the reason why we removed it, if you recall, is that we tried to remove measures that were subjective in nature. So we tried to come up with more quantitative measures to use as proxies for this, and which we did for several of the project types. So what's next? Really what we would like to get from you all today is there's several things. The first is a discussion about the existing criteria in second phase. Which ones, if not all, would you like to see continue on in our discussion? And if we do want to keep some or all of the existing criteria, what changes might you suggest for those criteria? And also, if there's anything new, other criteria that you think might be appropriate that we should consider in ultimately coming up with a recommendation to the board. What we hope to do, we would like you to concentrate on attributes that are measurable, and quite frankly that are easily accessible, because we're all about trying to streamline this process, certainly, so we don't want to overcomplicate anything. And what we'll do then, once we get the consensus of the group, we'll research it over the next month and provide back to you a recommendation based on the attributes that you provided that you can consider at the September MVEC meeting. At that, I'd be happy to open up to any questions or discussion.
I see Val first, then Herb.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I'm correct, the strategic corridors and the GHG reductions, those are out, are they not? Didn't we get rid of those?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, so those are out, okay. So then, secondly is the issue of equity. I think to begin with, I think the 25% is just too low. I think that we should have gone up 30%, but that's too late for that discussion. The issue here is one that we're taking strictly DRCOG funds to get the equity. So then what we should do then is compare that to the equity of DRCOG funds and not include CDOT and RTD. We're trying to correct the inequities, if there's any, from 2 other entities that we have no control over. So my suggestion would be to go ahead and use the equity when you do that spreadsheet out of just the DRCOG money only, tip money only, and don't include CDOT and RTD, because we're basically trying to correct inequities from another agency altogether. That would be my suggestion.
So actually, let me insert myself here and tell you how I'd like to run the meeting. we will go through the existing criteria quickly. I imagine the biggest discussion will be on the regional equity one, and then I will take suggestions on new criteria, and depending on how many we have, we'll either send them all to staff or we'll cull them down. So
Great.
before we get into your discussion on regional equity, just confirming that of the existing criteria, I assume everyone agrees the score is still a part of that.
Yes.
Just by virtue of the fact that we don't have any greenhouse gas emissions measurement now, and we no longer have strategic corridors, that everybody's fine with dropping those criteria. So the two remaining ones to discuss are the regional equity and the small communities. Val, you queued up the discussion on regional equity, so let's have that banter now. And where we'll end up is whether or not we want to keep it on the list of things for staff to bring back to us, and if there are specific things that we want them to take a look at in terms of calculating that. So I think, it was Herb first, then I see Jackie, then Robin.
I just had no, Don, put your hand down.
And then Don.
Just a clarification, on our small communities, are there any communities in any of our counties that are being left out of this consideration because of their size or tax dollars? If so, do we
No.
know who they are?
No, there are none that are being left out.
Okay, so we have all incorporated communities within our region covered at least through the small communities.
Correct.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know.
Okay, Jackie, and then Robin, and then Don.
And I think Val raised some interesting questions with equity, and I know we're not making decisions today, but giving you direction as to what we'd like to see. And what I'd like to see is perhaps just DRCOG dollars, but I would also like to see all federal dollars that have gone to the various communities. So potentially two views on equity, because I do think the receipt of federal dollars and potentially even, you know, the state CDOT dollar, any federal dollars, I think have to come into consideration. So I'm not ready to say yay or nay. I just think I'd like to see a column with DRCOG dollars and a column with all federal dollars that have gone to the various communities.
Definitely.
Robin?
So if you think about this formula as having two pieces, the prior comments have really focused on the piece about what's being spent. And I don't know that I'm ready at all to remove all of the CDOT and RTD spending, you know. But what I do believe is that there should be a symmetry between what's kind of measured on one side of the formula and what's measured on the other. So when I think about the expenditure list, CDOT kind of matches up on one side to the VMT that's on the bottom, right? So you measure how much people are driving in your jurisdiction, and then you measure how much you're getting in highway spending. They mirror each other, right? One is kind of what you're getting, and one is kind of what you're using or what you need. Provided, if we're keeping RTD in there on the expenditure side, what it seems like the formula is missing is what's being used on the transit side. And so whether that's you know, people who are getting on transit or off, right, because they might get on in one community and they might get off in another, or it's like percentage of your population that's using transit. I think you lose the worker commuter piece if you do that, but it seems like there needs to be a matching piece. So Denver, you know, we'd really like to see some research on something that is kind of the mirror to VMT for the RTD spending. So, you know, not saying we should take out RTD, but if we're counting it, let's count how much the jurisdiction's, you know, residents are using it. I definitely think that the transportation-related sales tax is odd. You know, we tried to do some digging because no one in our jurisdiction could kind of remember where it came from. And, you know, it's sales of cars. So it doesn't really measure driving. It doesn't measure impacts. It just, you know, and it also, when you pay sales tax on a car, it doesn't go for transportation. It goes to the city's general fund. So it's not like any of the dollars that people spend buying a car in a county go for transportation in that county or to the regional pot or even to the federal pot. So it just is, to us, I mean, this isn't really a research thing. unless I would say if we're going to have a revenue figure in there, it should be a revenue figure about what's being really contributed to transportation. It really doesn't matter what I tax myself to pay for my own general fund. It just doesn't have any bearing on transportation. So maybe it's the contribution that a community or a county, because these are all done at the county level, right?
That's correct.
So it's the county's contribution. What does the county pay in gas tax? Like that would be a relevant figure, but because that actually does go for transportation, right? And so, and that's how a lot of the national formulas, when they determine which states are winners and which states are losers, they measure how much those states pay in gas tax versus how much they get in transportation funding. So I would just like to see us kind of make sure that we're using things that make sense. And so we may have a couple other ideas, but I want to kind of see where the conversation goes on some of these other pieces of the formula, because I'm sure there's a lot of other ideas. Thanks.
Don?
Sorry, you caught me working on the computer here.
You're not multitasking, are you?
I am. I'm triple tasking. Thank you, Madam Chair. Don Rocher, Jefferson County. And I'm going to have to agree with Val and Jackie in regards when talking about financial equity. And when you look at taking out, I like the idea of taking out the component of, just looking at DRCOG dollars and taking out CDOT dollars and also the RTD dollars. And the way I'm looking at this is, what if CDOT came through Jefferson County and put in all these new improvements on I-70? You know, that improves I-70, but will it count against us? Would it have a potential of saying equity-wise, hey, you already got all this money. This occurred in Jefferson County, but those are such large regional improvements, it would have a negative effect on that equity to the county. So I like the idea of looking at it on a county level, looking at the equity and taking out that CDOT and RTD type dollars. So Val, I think that's a great idea.
Phil? I guess you were first, yes? Or Shakti? And then Bill.
Doug, looking at the possibility of more complexities, two areas of consideration. One is so we get used to some items that we know are going to be impactful as we look at some things. Taking a look at the MAP criteria, which is the benefit side, not necessarily where the expenditure side is, but possibly in this tail end to this cycle, possibly introducing some new considerations. And I know the thought is the MAP 21 criteria is future projections, and then how do we measure against those, and how do we keep ourselves honest on that. But as we're dealing with this tail end of the TIP allocation, the 25%, this may be a time to introduce some of that when we're not necessarily providing it as the biggest risk element on the larger projects, and might get us to the point where we understand how some of the federal components are going to be working. And
Phil, is this related to regional equity?
No.
Or you're adding, could you hold on your other criteria till we finish regional equity, and then Adam, do you mind? I think it would be helpful to the discussion. Sorry to cut you off. We won't lose the first one you mentioned. So Shakti and then Bill, if this is regional equity, or we'll wrap that up and then move on to you guys.
I just wondered, we recently had the conversation about person miles traveled versus vehicle miles traveled, and I'm interested in thinking about whether that would make sense here too.
You mean sort of related to what Robin was talking about in terms of?
Yeah, related to what Robin was talking about, and maybe broader than that.
Not very much. Okay. Bill?
I would just like to voice our support of taking out the CDOT and RTD TIP projects as part of the criteria. I support my colleague from Jefferson County. In addition, I have some concerns about the contribution issue. And in fact, our county and probably Jeffco would benefit from this to some degree. But it is a measurement that does not really reflect that transportation, those transportation vehicles purchased in the county are actually going to be used in the county. And it does give kind of an unfairness to those who don't have a cluster of automobile dealerships in their area. I know a lot of people drive up, hundreds of miles to come into Denver or to Jeffco or to Arapahoe County to purchase cars. So it's kind of it kind of provides a skewed benefit to those of us who retain a large number of dealerships in our area.
Actually, the automobile sales tax goes to where the car is registered. So it's registered location, not necessarily what dealership.
Okay.
So any other final comments on regional equity? Otherwise, I'll try to give staff direction based on what I heard. Robin, did you have something else?
Yeah, I was just curious about whether, and I don't know if the staff knows, if DRCOG has ever looked at jobs. I mean, we did some of this in the, there was some conversation about jobs and in the equity conversation, the environmental justice, connecting jobs. And I was just curious whether or not there's ever been use or talk about jobs in this formula. So I'd be curious to see whether or not that's a way of looking at what the contribution, the word contribution I'm stuck on.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not really
not
contributing population or VMT. I think of it as need,
Right.
or use or
Exactly.
something. But anyway.
Yeah, I don't know historically if we've ever looked at jobs. I'll look at Steve here. Yeah, it's certainly easy to do, and I actually didn't know what direction this would go here today. So I mean, staff does have an opinion, believe it or not, on certain. I know.
Wow.
I just might share real quick just some of we looked at and we had some of the things that were talked about here today is stuff that we would like to consider as we look at our research and provide you with a recommendation next month. In the equity equation on the contribution side, for example, mean employment actually was one that we like to look at. Any kind of sales tax, general sales tax. The one we're really interested, or actually two we're really interested in, is the Highway Users Trust Fund contribution. We've initiated some research on that to see if we can get that data by county, and it appears we can, although there's something squirrely going on with the information we have, and we're trying to get some additional information just to see if we can rectify the problems with that data. But that would indeed provide some thought about, and it gets back to the gas tax issue, how much money per county is being that contribution to the county through their highway trust fund. RTD sales tax, for example, is another one, and that speaks probably to what Robin was suggesting earlier about the balance. Are we showing the RTD investment? So are we showing the RTD contribution? That's a possibility. So really, those are the ones that we kind of thought to ourselves. I'm just
Now
for your
you tell
consideration.
us. Okay.
I wanted to know what you guys were going to come up with first. I didn't want to cloud your judgment.
Okay, I see Sue, Don, then Val. Sue?
Don kind of wanted to tee it up, but what I would say about the proposal that I see up here is that if you're a small community or a sort of bedroom type community, you're not going to have the employment, and you'll get beaten up a couple times on that. You're already beaten up because you don't have RTD, and you're not going to get RTD, and so you don't have sales tax.
Isn't it by county?
Daily boardings.
Yeah, by county.
By county.
It's not.
Not by your community, but by the county. Just, I didn't mean to interrupt, but in terms of equity formula.
So what you're saying is the equity formula would be the same for everyone in, in Adams County.
Yeah, I
And
should
if
have
you're
clarified
split
that
between
too,
two
Mayor.
counties, what do you do with that?
Ooh.
Which a lot of us are. Quite a few of us are split between
Steve,
two
just-
or more counties.
Pick
Yeah.
your favorite.
Yeah, okay, then
Steve-
I'm down with that. It's going to be
Steve,
a
just-
lot more bus service, I'm guessing.
Okay, that's the moment
That's
for
exact-
staff clarification about,
So
It
I'm
is-
just throwing those out as some things to consider. I do think employment, and maybe it should, it is going to obviously really benefit employment centers and be a disadvantage to non-employment centers. But the reverse argument is, well, so there's a lot more driving in and out of those employment centers. But that's just something to consider.
Can I just clarify two things with staff? One is you weren't suggesting getting rid of population.
No.
You were just, these are other things to consider.
Right.
Okay.
And it would not include all of these. I mean, because
These are
there's
distinctions
redundancy
like that.
built in. I mean, we would, choose to make sure that there's value to any of these to be included in that population or calculation.
Okay, so we still have Don, then Val, then Jackie, and, no. Okay, Don?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Don Rozier, Jefferson County. Just to go a little further with the RTD, understand the sales tax side, daily boardings. Just note with Jefferson County, when they opened the W line, they really cut back, and in most cases in South Jefferson County, eliminated bus service altogether. And so if you look at our daily boardings, they don't exist from where they were. So it would penalize those counties where RTD has cut back significantly, especially those outlying parts of the county where they may not serve because they don't feel like they're cost effective. And those are the areas we're looking to try to, in this second tier, to help. So it's a disadvantage. Thank you.
Okay, Val, then Jackie, and then I'm going to try to wrap us up on this particular criteria.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If you go back to the first slide that we had, with all the little squares in there, if my understanding is correct, the purpose of that last square in the bottom right-hand side is we've set some set-asides based on certain criteria. Then we took 75% of what was left over, and we scored that on the criteria that we set out. And my understanding of that 25% was that is to correct for in case any of the other prior criteria that we set up, we ended up overseeing some of the smaller communities. So now the more criteria we put into that 25% again, we're going to cause exactly the same problem as we went through there. And then to finish, I guess, my last comment is that we're talking about DRCOG money. We're not talking about CDOT money or RTD money. We're trying to control our money itself, period.
Jackie?
I guess in the interest of, I don't know enough to know which of those potential other factors make sense or don't make sense right now, but what I really have to say is I appreciate the fact that staff looked at it and came up with a list of things to address concerns. And I look forward to, when you start manipulating some of them, seeing how it all plays out and how it changes what we've done in the past. Or if it doesn't, I mean, we're all potentially worried about it, how it may or may not impact it, and it may not impact it at all. So I guess what I want is, I say, okay, have at it, guys. Let me see what it looks like. And I do think, if you could go back to that, the idea of whether or not you got a project funded in first phase is very important. And I think I'm really glad you brought that up, and that I think that should be, in my opinion, relevant. So the equity formula, I'm not sure, but I do think what you got in the first phase matters in the second phase to me.
Okay, I'm going to just try to, since all we're doing is giving direction to staff on this, what I'm hearing is that we think regional equity as a criteria should still be in phase 2 criteria.
Right.
And looking at how you define regional equity, it sounds like we're interested in seeing staff take a look at a number of things. One, what happens if you split out and just look at DRCOG money versus the federal other RTD and CDOT pots as well. That we're interested in looking at some of the criteria that staff came up with, which includes employment and a transit component.
Correct.
I didn't hear anybody or staff suggest that the transportation sales tax was a particularly good piece of the formula to keep. So I think you're free to come back with a recommendation, or potentially to drop that and replace it with something that's a little bit more relevant. Does that sound roughly that I capture the things that we'd like staff to explore and bring back to us?
Yes, and just to add on the transportation-related sales tax, one of the difficulties in using the highway user tax fund contribution, it's where I fill my car up, not necessarily where I'm doing most of my driving.
Very true.
Whereas where my car is registered has probably an idea of where at least I depart from at some point in time. So
Good point.
you can kind of look at that.
Yeah, indeed.
Sue?
And I liked your term transit versus RTD, and that would be my comment based on Dawn's comment and mine, which is a lot of communities are having last mile issues. They may come up with some sort of shuttle, some sort of smart car type relief for that. Other locations like ours may need to come up with a shuttle into and out of town. So if we're going to do a credit, I would like it to see them explore transit in general, not just RTD, because that could encompass those last mile issues and issues for municipalities that don't have any service.
Okay. Oh, Kathy?
Just as a follow-up to Sue, so you wanted to keep daily boardings in, but just as a transit altogether? Because I guess I would like to get a feel if we have enough support for daily boardings, because the part that I have an issue there is we don't control that. And you could have it today, and by the time that project actually gets on the ground, you won't have it, or vice versa. So it's not within our control, so I hate scoring something on that criteria with the experiences that we've all had.
So I'm not necessarily saying keep it in, but when you're exploring that as an option, or if you're exploring it, I just think it's better to expand it to include all transit and all boardings on all transit, if in
Right.
fact you keep it in.
That's great.
It may not make sense to do it.
Right, I agree it should be all. I'm just have a lot of concerns about the daily boardings because it's just not consistent and reliable.
Robin, and then I'm going to move us on.
Yeah, since I brought this up, I just want to clarify. I think doing all transit is fine. I think the main thing is if RTD spending is going to count against a county, then the users have to be counted. So if you throw RTD spending out, then it may matter less, but if it stays in, you can't count it on one side of the formula and not the other. And I think there's a lot of ways you could do it with census users of transit or something rather than RTD data or whatever, so that's good. The other thing I just want to remind everybody about, and I think probably everyone knows this, but this formula doesn't get used to distribute any money. What we've done in the past, I think, is you kind of like, you look at it and you kind of say, well, do we want to emphasize communities that are over equity or under equity? It's not actually a funding formula. So I think that this one, unlike the TIP criteria, is never used to actually distribute anything in my history with the organization. So I just thought that might be good to clarify. If I might not have said it right, but it's literally like a smell test that we do. We look at it and then we decide whether we want to create some priorities or not.
Goodwill.
We never put money into the formula and get allocations out,
That's
right?
very, very true, and I'm glad you said that. I don't want to underestimate that either. That is true. The smell test is a very good way of putting it, and I might use that if you don't mind. But it does. I mean, it's not, we don't score projects in second phase. I mean, these are just guiding principles, so we can see if they pass the smell test. We want to make sure, for very small communities, for example, that we want to make sure that they're equally represented in second phase.
Okay,
I just want to say, but that doesn't mean we wouldn't moving forward. That's
Sure.
technically correct. In the past, we haven't done it, but we don't. I mean, these are new rules, and that's what we're coming up with now. And this is the new set of TIP criteria. So nothing's set in stone.
Okay, so where we are is we have kept regional equity on a list for staff to bring back with fully fleshed out criteria. The other existing criteria is small communities. I'm assuming, based on the conversation we've had so far, that most people want to keep that on as a phase 2 criteria. We can discuss in detail if we want to redefine small communities, which we recently did, but otherwise we could just tell staff to keep it on. Is everybody, straw poll? Can we keep it on? Okay. So then I would like to move to new criteria, and maybe we can do some brainstorming depending on how long this list gets. We may have to go back and cull it, because these are things that we want staff to look into and bring back to us as potential criteria. Does that make sense? I cut Phil off, so I'm going to return to you.
Very much appreciated. It would be to look at the benefit areas that are going to be looked at for the federal dollars that we're going to need to be tracking. So it's kind of our clinical metrics, approach and use this as possibly a test cauldron or the beginning cauldron to take a look at that. Second is possibly looking at some items that are more directly related to MetroVision goals and less related to proxies, since we didn't have time to do that for the 75% because we needed to get that call out, would be possibly to be using this for that second phase, or at least some consideration of that.
Tim.
Yeah, I'd like us to take a look at a new criteria that would allow us to fund some additional bike ped projects. And it's interesting when you pull out the numbers. Over the past 3 tip cycles, 32 of the 53 unfunded projects, or 60%, were bike ped. And then over the past 3 cycles, 32% of bike ped requests have gone unfunded. And over the last 2 cycles, 2/3 of unfunded projects were bike ped. So I think that as you look at this, I mean, to me it seems like the local agencies are really looking at some of the bike ped projects that they want, and they're not getting done. So I'd like to see if we can make that happen.
Jackie?
I guess, but, you know, those are interesting statistics, and it makes me wonder about some of the other projects. So if you look at gross dollars, I guess if you're going to take gross dollars, what projects haven't been funded? Is it roadway capacity? Is it, instead of just the number of projects, by category of projects, I think it would be interesting to take a look at what's been funded roadway operationally, you know, capacity-wise. So, I mean, in the context of asking for information from staff, I'd like to have an understanding of the dollars, not just the numbers of projects that haven't been funded. And I guess given the fact that our partners at CDOT have let us know they don't have enough money to fund and maintain our roads, I guess reconstruction, I think, to me, should be a priority for our transportation projects, and potentially something to be considered in the second phase is, you know, reconstruction of roads that are not, you know, so that, enough said. You know where I'm going with it. So I guess I'd like that to be considered as well.
Ron, then Doug.
You know, there's another factor that overlays all of this that we never talk about, and that is what communities put in and don't get, but then wind up funding by themselves. And I think that kind of changes the whole dynamic, in that you know, if it's important to a community, and we've recently spent some money on bike ped, in fact a fair amount, even though it would be nice for Santa to have brought this to us, you know, sometimes you don't get the pony you want, so you constantly have to go out and buy your own pony.
I got yelled at for missing people on this side, and I completely lost track. So, Don, why don't you go? No, it was Doug, then Don. Doug, Bob, then Don. All right, sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Tim's comment, because I think it's even broader than just the bike ped. I think to some extent we're talking last mile, or first mile if you prefer, last mile connections, because I think that there is an absolute reality of bike ped being a last mile solution for many people, and they don't all live in Boulder, they live elsewhere too.
Okay,
and,
good to know.
And I think that the overall sense is somewhat broader than just bike ped. I think it is also last mile, and that should be a criterion that we do give credibility and credit to.
Could I? Well, I'll put myself in the queue after Don. Bob, I think you're up.
Yeah. The comment I'd like to make, and actually Tim and Doug kind of both took one piece of it. Is it not on?
It's closer.
Doug and Tim each took one piece of it, but I think that the last mile, first mile, and the bike ped, but I think that we would like to see it specifically related to light rail operations support. So that first last mile and the bike ped related to the light rail operations support would be something that we'd like to see.
And for those of us who don't have light rail,
Yeah.
perhaps regular transit?
Yeah, that might be a problem in Boulder. I don't know. It's,
I know. Don, you're up. Don?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Don Rozier, Jefferson County. Thank you, Doug, because that's exactly what I was going to talk about is that last mile piece of it, and I think it's very key there. And I agree with Jackie too. When we start looking at, if we play a numbers game, sheer numbers, it's easy to submit 25 of a certain area here and 25 over here and 50 over here. But I think it should be prioritized. The importance and the need should weigh heavy on the decision more than just the sheer numbers and the volumes of projects being submitted. So to me, looking at what CDOT has told us, looking at what we're seeing in our communities, it's those number one priorities should shake out to the top. Thank you.
So I was going to offer my support for the notion of sort of the first and last mile bike ped, because I think not only are those projects popular across the whole region, relatively small but big bang for your buck, but they are instrumental in making our transit work as well, and that really directly relates back to I think what Phil was suggesting about hitting on some of our MetroVision goals in terms of reducing BMT. So I would add to that. I wanted to introduce another potential criteria, which is looking at interregional projects where projects that might start in one MPO and end in another. The example in my area is the Flex bus route that starts in Fort Collins and goes down to Longmont and will go into Boulder and down to CU. It's a very successful bus route, doesn't have permanent funding, but it doesn't score particularly well in our region because you can only sort of take credit for half of the benefit because that's the benefit in our region, as opposed to looking at it as a project that leverages another MPO to also invest and create a interregional benefit that's pretty large. So we have another example with the Climb, which goes over into up in the mountains over into Gilpin, where the two counties are working together on that. I don't know if other people have examples of where they have projects that start in the DRCOG region and exit, but I wanted to throw that out as something for consideration. Obviously, DRCOG monies only fund the DRCOG portion, but just in terms of assessing the benefits. Kathy, you're up next.
I'd just like to follow up with some of the ideas that we're doing. Could we then also identify what other funding those types of projects are available? Because I believe the new CDOT money is now these transit projects that are outside of RTD, and a lot of that exactly was what they went for. So there's additional monies in other pots, so I don't want to dilute our pot if they are eligible now for other dollars. And I think, you know, in some of our communities, bike ped, I mean, we have an open space tax in Arapahoe County, so we don't submit bike ped projects very much because we do them in our open space. So we're happy to use your transportation dollars, but as Ron said, we kind of took care of it ourselves, and we use our open space for bike and ped paths. That's how we've handled this, saving transportation dollars for transportation dollars. And I guess also because it seemed like there was a defined amount that we had to match in bike ped in phase 1. So I want to make sure that whatever we're looking at, because many things could have other funding, whatever. So can we just, when we're identifying, say, and this is also eligible for this, that, or the other? Because if we can get a criteria that isn't eligible for anything else, that might be what we want to focus on the most. So I guess I want to know the other funding sources. Thank you.
Other criteria ideas? I have one more. I don't want to monopolize. We were talking about this in the officers' meeting, that there are some projects where multiple jurisdictions have small projects that in and of themselves don't quite add up to enough. And I'm thinking of a bike shelter, for example. But if you were to put together a multi-jurisdictional package along a corridor, then that could be meaningful in terms of, again, going to the first and last mile. And right now, those, I don't think that you can do a project that way. So again, having communities work together on a corridor to fund small pieces of the project up and down might be an interesting way. Mr. Tisdale.
Yeah, and in fact, just so that it isn't perceived as something that would only relate to bike ped, anytime you have jurisdictions collaborating together on a project, that certainly should be a critical point of analysis for us when we look at this final 25% pot and say, everybody's playing nice in the sandbox. Let's reward that behavior.
Very good. Just to clarify, I mean, it is eligible now, and certainly we encourage that, but we don't call it out. So what you're suggesting is we call that out to recognize it in second phase when you're looking at projects. So
Yeah.
we can do that, certainly.
Okay. Val?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just wanted to give an example of what we funded, I think, last year or year before, and that was the 92nd intersection in Federal Heights that addressed Thornton, unincorporated Adams, Broomfield, Westminster, Federal Heights. It was all a combination of a lot of municipalities, so that's a perfect example.
Shakti, did you had talked about person miles traveled, and I wanted to make sure we caught that in this phase of staff. I assume staff's taking notes. I am as well.
Yes.
But if we fully flesh that out for the purposes of criteria here, didn't want to lose that idea. If there's any more you wanted to say on that.
I don't really have more to say. It's more a question that, what were the reasons that it was appropriate in the last conversation, and is it appropriate in this conversation for the same reasons? So.
Okay. Jackie?
And then I guess what I'd also like to know, as we put all of this together, if staff has an opinion on whether or not something has been addressed and kind of already been taken into account in the first phase or in the scoring of the projects, which is also going to be reflected in this second phase.
Right.
You know, I don't want double counting or, you know, one thing getting, potentially, I'd like to, those, I'm not sure I want it or I don't want it. I guess what I want it to do is to be identified as this was taken into account in the first phase scoring and selection already. So if you could just flag those.
Yeah, no, we certainly will. I'm trying to absorb this like everybody else right now, but we will as we go forth over the next month and make those determinations.
Sue?
And the other thing I think is that we have a lot of good suggestions here. All of them are good suggestions. I would kind of ask staff, though, to keep an eye on whether we've diluted the process so much that we all offset each other and nobody ends up actually getting any preference in the second piece. So it just seems to me that maybe all of them could be included and it's still a really good process, but maybe we say, okay, you know what, we want to limit this at like 5 preferences or something like that, so it doesn't get so diluted it's not meaningful.
So I think that's a really good point, Sue. There's 2 ways we could do it. We could take our list of brainstorming and limit it now, or we can give it to staff, have them take a look at it, collect the information, provide it for us, and maybe give their staff recommendations on what that prioritization might look like.
You know, might I respectfully suggest that I think, quite honestly, staff is more than capable, having taken careful notes as to each of the items that we've raised, understanding how some of them were simply variations on the same theme.
Yep.
And we were simply shading it one way or the other when we really were talking about one point. They can condense and consolidate, and if we were try artificially to go back and reconstruct and kind of do a straw poll on each one, I think we would find ourselves very frustrated and not very productive.
Excellent. So I agree with you. So why don't we send staff off? I roughly counted 6 ideas, but several of them, as Doug pointed out, you know, if we're trying to match up with them MetroVision criteria, I mean, that covers some of the things we talked about. So with that, then, if people feel comfortable with that conversation, then let's move to our second agenda item, action item.
Great, thank you.
Which you would think I would remember. So again, we're going to provide staff direction regarding the urban centers element of the MetroVision 2040. And a couple things that might be helpful. We're just beginning our discussions about MetroVision, so there are a lot of future discussions we're going to have about what goals we think should be added or changed in MetroVision. Tonight's discussion is really just to hone in on a core sort of element or guiding principle of the last MetroVision, which is around urban centers. So I think staff want to walk away with, yes, urban centers are still an important sort of organizing principle for MetroVision, and then two, more details about, if so, what information do they need to generate for us to help us set metrics or goals or benchmarks around that.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Very well set up. I will be the first to admit this is going to be kind of a drinking from the fire hose moment. I have a lot of information that I'm going to give you tonight, so that's why I printed copies of this presentation. And I am probably going to speak as fast as I can and maybe not breathe for about 20 or 25 minutes, just because we've done a lot with this already, particularly with stakeholders, including your staff, as well as other people that are interested in this topic over the past probably 6 or 9 months. And we want to make sure you understand all the ground that's been covered on this particular topic. As the chair mentioned, this is a sliver of what you will ultimately see as part of the MetroVision 2040 plan, but it is an increasingly important part of that conversation. So I did not want, I'm certainly going to focus on the urban centers part of this conversation, but just a quick overall MetroVision 2040 update, and I don't think this is news to anyone, but the board last month did recommend that we form ad hoc working groups to think about integrating the issues of housing and economic vitality into MetroVision 2040. The deadline for volunteering for that was actually on Monday. And so the full board will see the folks that will ultimately serve on those groups at your board meeting later this month, with the meetings beginning sometime in September. So that's sort of everything else but urban centers, kind of a quick update. So to give you an idea of what you're going to hear this afternoon, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, kind of the history of what urban centers are, where they came from, that sort of thing. I will walk you through, like I mentioned, we've covered a lot of ground in the last 6-9 months with stakeholders around the region, so I want you to kind of have an understanding of what that includes. There is an attachment that was part of the memo that includes some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight, but there's some things that are in that attachment that I'm not going to cover. So between the two, I think you'll get a pretty good sense of things. We have spent a lot of time with the MetroVision Planning Advisory Committee this summer talking specifically about urban centers, so I certainly wanted to give you their feedback, and then I do have a couple of slides for very specific questions that we have for you this evening, but obviously we're open to anything that you might want to give us feedback on. So a little bit of background. For those that don't know, we currently have 104 urban centers that are currently designated in MetroVision. And I think it's important to note that this is not a static number. We've added about a dozen or so just in the last 2 years. So as people begin to, at the local level, identify places that are consistent with the attributes of urban centers that are laid out in MetroVision, we continuously add them through our plan assessment process. So here's sort of the overall regional picture, and I'm going to do kind of a quick visual tour of a couple of examples of urban centers from around the region, so you can kind of get a sense of what these places are like. The most recent one approved by the DRCOG board is Littleton downtown. We also have places like the Westminster Activity Center. I just love this aerial because you can actually see the mall being demolished, sort of mid-demolition. So places that are obviously seeing a lot of change and potential for population and employment growth over the next 25 or 30 years, if not sooner. We have places like Cherry Creek and Glendale, sort of twin sister urban centers that are in many ways often, largely built out, right? Lots of this land is obviously already spoken for, but we'll continue to see redevelopment over time. And sort of the flip side of that are two urban centers, one in Broomfield, one in the city of Thornton up at State Highway 7 and I-25 that are largely greenfield sites. But over the next 15, 20, 25 years, we're actually anticipating significant amount of growth in these areas, and obviously there are infrastructure demands that will come with that growth as well. Then we have places, sort of the flip side of the Westminster example, the Lakewood Center, which includes Belmar. So, a redevelopment that has matured and actually come to life. Places like downtown Castle Rock under the new criteria that we use, places that are more scaled at maybe a Main Street scale are now eligible to be designated. And Castle Rock has some really interesting regulatory things that they do. In fact, in downtown Castle Rock, there are no parking requirements. If you want to build parking, you can build parking. But if you don't have to, right? So they've actually done some really sophisticated things that in many ways you could think of as really urban type attributes or features, but obviously in a more Western Main Street scale. And then another recent one that was also added in Centennial is the sort of the South Glen area. So another area that has seen a lot of redevelopment over the last 5-10 years or so. So that's sort of your quick visual tour. So some brief history. The gist here is that urban centers have been around for a long time as a concept here at DRCOG and in our region, dating back to plans from the late 70s. The concept of urban centers appears in the MetroVision guiding vision that this board adopted over 20 years ago, back in 1992, which has in many ways been the framework that we've worked on in terms of MetroVision for the last 20 years. I think it's important to note in that third bullet, urban centers are not DRCOG saying, thou shalt be an urban center. Urban centers come from local communities saying, we have an area that is a priority area for us for growth, and we feel like it's consistent with the attributes of urban centers that MetroVision espouses. And so that's really how the process works. And so in some ways, we went through a series of fits and starts where we had 4 or 5 years in the early days where, frankly, our process was way too complicated. The first urban center designated was Glendale, which you saw previously. It took 5 years from the time urban centers existed as a concept in MetroVision for it to actually come to pass, because we had created maybe a few too many speed bumps along the way. So we were constantly thinking about how that designation can be simplified and improved. And so the 50-75 goal, so accommodating 50% of new housing and 75% of new employment in our region within urban centers over the next 25 years or so, was actually a goal that was added during the MetroVision 2035 update process, also known as the sustainability update. So a little bit about that. That direction came from our board really beginning in early 2009 at the board workshop. They directed staff that we should do an update of MetroVision 2035, and let's think about how to more fully incorporate the notion of sustainability into the plan. About midway through that year, we had a series of sustainability cafes, which were really sort of early opportunities for stakeholder input to help us as a region define what sustainability meant here in the Denver region. And then really, obviously, that then turned over to the board. So the board went through a process, as well as NVIC, to go from 30 basic concepts that would really kind of say what would a sustainable Denver region look like in the future, and got us down to 17 or so. And then later in 2009, NVIC and the board both approved 6 draft goal statements at the time, and really directed staff to say, okay, let's figure out, we have these things that we like. Those are things like accommodating 50% of housing and 75% of employment in urban centers, but there was also the VMT reduction, as well as things related to greenhouse gas. But let's figure out from a modeling perspective, are these within the realm of the possible? And so late 2009, early 2010, we started that process and presented this back to the board in February of 2010, with the general sort of findings being, overall, yes, these goals are aggressive. Let's not kid ourselves. They're very ambitious, both including the urban centers goal, but also the VMT goal, the percent of commute trips via SOV. They're all aggressive, but they are within the realm of the possible. Specifically when it comes to urban centers, what was really interesting is when we go through that local designation or recognition process, local communities tell us what their expectations are for population and employment in the long term. Really, that 75% goal was pretty consistent with what local aspirations lined up to. If you took the local aspirations for all the urban centers that we had at the time, they expected to accommodate 70% of the region's jobs over that 25 or 30-year period. So really pretty in line with kind of where the locals thought the job growth was going to occur. The housing side was a little bit more ambitious, with, we were basically at double that capture rate compared to what locals were aspiring to at the time. And the key thing that really came out of that modeling work is really establishing the link between urban centers as a concept and all the other things of the region that are important to us. And you may have seen this graphic before. We use it all the time, but really, in many ways, urban centers are at the center, pun intended, I guess, of our region, and how we actually achieve all the other goals that are really highlighted in MetroVision. You achieve the urban centers goal, you achieve the goal that we have as a region to increase overall density by 10%. You contribute to a region that ultimately per capita consumes less water. You contribute to a region that actually allows more people to travel to work into other places by modes other than a single occupancy vehicle. You lower VMT. So really, it is in many ways at the crux of our ability to achieve a lot of the things that we've obviously as a board have said are important to us. I use this. This is the actual set of policies associated with urban centers in the adopted version of MetroVision 2035. Don't squint and try to read them. I just think the important thing to point out is that the 50-75 gets kind of all the play. That's what everybody focuses on. But there's a whole policy framework associated with urban centers that is beyond really just accommodating that tremendous amount of housing and employment. It really lays out the foundation that these places should be, multimodal, mixed use, have a variety of housing options, be more intense and denser than the areas around them. There's the third policy it says MetroVision prioritizes urban centers around existing or proposed transit stations or with high frequency bus service. So for instance, when we were going through the TIP criteria process for phase one, that was one of the things that staff brought to you and suggested that we should be thinking about prioritizing urban centers that actually have that high frequency transit service because MetroVision says that we should do that. So in many ways this colors a lot of what we do and what we bring forward to you as you make decisions each and every month. So this was actually something that we talked about at the board, I believe back in June, to kind of just give you, okay, we've got these ambitious goals of accommodating 50% of housing and 75% of employment at urban centers, so really how are we doing? And the most recent analysis that we did, 21% of the housing units within our region were captured in urban centers between 2005 and 2010. We noted in June, I'll note again, is that we really are seeing an upward trend on this, and frankly, if we had more recent data, which we're actually currently in the process of working on, I think that 21% would be substantially higher. I think we all recognize the last 24, 36 months have been about building apartments as fast and as furiously as possible in this region, and many of those have occurred within urban centers. We are tracking a little bit better on the employment side of things. Over half of the jobs, new jobs in the region in that 8-year period actually occurred in urban centers. So we are certainly sort of transitioning or moving closer towards the board adopted goal. So it's great that these things exist, but how do we sort of use them in our kind of day-to-day life? And so obviously this should be familiar to you. This is from the TIP evaluation criteria for phase one. That obviously we currently have a call for projects out that will use this. So obviously this group agreed with continuing to emphasize urban centers in that process, including, as I mentioned, thinking about making sure that we prioritize those places that are served by high capacity transit, but at the same time also thinking of the other things that MetroVision says is critical to urban centers ultimately delivering on the promise that they have, and that's thinking about mixed use development. It's thinking about innovative strategies like parking management and things like that. So in many ways we're carrying through what's in MetroVision 2035. But we do other things as well. And Doug's slide, his very first slide, you may have missed the box all the way, I guess it was on the upper left-hand corner, but we do have set-asides that we have had over the past few TIP cycles, and the board has committed quite a bit of funds to actually providing money for local communities to do studies within urban centers and station areas. So to date, $6 million has been committed of federal funds to these, and the current TIP will set aside another $2.4 million to think about sort of the land use and transportation and other challenges within these areas. But another thing that we worked on in the last probably 6 to 9 months was something called the Regional Housing Diversity Study. Because of that 50% goal, we were hearing a lot sort of from stakeholders that particularly the sort of issue of construction defects was ultimately going to hamper the ability of this region to meet that goal. Because ultimately you were taking an entire type of product, one that is ultimately very ripe for urban centers, sort of off the table. And so we looked at sort of how would that legislation ultimately or potentially impact the ability of our communities to continue to add housing in those environments. So because of that goal, we really did want to focus on that issue. So that's a lot of background. I'll go to the sort of where we're going and where we've been sort of more recently. We talked a lot with this group, but also with the board about scenario planning. We largely did this in kind of the mid part of last year, sort of culminating in the later part of 2013. So a few kind of highlights specifically about urban centers and that work. And I don't know if you would call this two sides of the same coin, but it's certainly two coins in the same pocket. We really found in that work that if you really do incorporate an adjustment to sort of bump the amount of development, population, and employment in urban centers, you see a lot of benefit on things like VMT and SOV mode share and things like that. Flip side of that, if you do not do that in the scenario analysis work, you actually see what I would call backsliding. In the example, in the scenarios that did not really sort of think about highlighting growth and development in urban centers, we actually saw VMT increase relative to the base, right? So it's sort of urban centers, you really are working, you're making progress. If you're not focusing on urban centers, you're actually in some ways going backwards on key goals that this board has established. Some other things that we've been working on. We did a survey of all the communities that have urban centers to really just kind of get a sense as to what's going on now, maybe in the last 2 or 3 years. As part of that process, we did a series of interviews as well to kind of get even sort of a more finer grain set of information that we could obviously present to this group. We held a MetroVision idea exchange, had about 55 or 60 folks in this room to talk about development challenges and opportunities within urban centers. And we've done a little bit of sort of in-house analysis as well that I'll share. So I will hit kind of the highlights on this because I think a lot of this is actually in the attachment. But one of the things I was personally curious in is sort of this notion of urban centers within your community. Did they actually weather the downturn or the slow times with the housing market pretty well? And the answer was yes. Nearly 2/3 or nearly everyone that responded said that ultimately urban centers actually weathered the recession better than other parts of their community, and many are actively seeing an intensification of uses within those areas. One of the things that was interesting to me is that we think of urban centers as this growth framework, right? 50% of new housing, 75% of new employment over the next 25 years going into these places. But there were several of them that mentioned in many ways our center is built out. It's actually pretty well developed now. There will be a little bit of development here and there, but it's not going to absorb large amounts of development in the future. And so that's an interesting sort of juxtaposition with the notion of these places really are supposed to be capturing quite a bit of growth. There was some confusion, and I think there continues to be confusion about the 50-75 goal. Some communities were just convinced that that was not a collective regional goal, but that it was DRCOG's expectation that if you as a community have 3 urban centers, we expect you to capture 50% of your housing and 75% of your employment growth within those centers. That's not really how we think about the goal, and that's not really how we think of any goal with MetroVision. All MetroVision goals are ultimately collective, right? We expect the region to do that, and some communities are going to be able to contribute in ways that other communities cannot. Many are actively looking to add particularly multifamily product within their urban center. More than 80% are really actively trying to add apartments, condos, mixed use with residential. The one thing that we heard pretty loud and clear is that has largely been market rate. There's been a little bit of sort of work on the margins to sort of think about subsidized or assisted housing, but I think in some ways just getting housing interested in these areas has been enough of a challenge that people have not necessarily been able to make that leap yet. On the sort of employment side of things, in terms of creating places where we can obviously locate jobs, I don't think this is really a surprise, but we heard pretty consistently that the oversupply of commercially zoned land, both within the center and adjacent to the center, oftentimes is ultimately cannibalizing the ability of that place to add jobs and employment. There's some redevelopment opportunities that come with that, whether it's vacant big box or that sort of thing. But everyone knows those projects aren't easy, right? So it's great that that's an opportunity, but it takes a lot of work to actually see some development happen there. Lots of folks struggling with small parcels and fractured ownership. And this is particularly tough on both the housing and the commercial side because a lot of times those folks are looking for larger assemblages, right? And so they can't necessarily find the site that works for what they're trying to build. And unfortunately, that parcel consolidation is hard both in sort of your weaker markets, where it's what's the point of consolidating if you don't have someone to take on that project, and it's hard in the strong markets because the prices have gotten so much that assemblage gets really expensive, and so it's just a really tough thing to get around. So in general, we found during the survey and interview process that the centers that have kind of large undeveloped parcels or have a really entrenched and established business district tended to do better in terms of adding employment over the last 5 years or so. A lot of folks have used a variety of strategies to attract employment to their center. We heard pretty consistently that those with rail stations have tended to have a leg up. It's just a selling point that you have that not everyone else has. People are upzoning to give a little bit more entitlement to try to entice development. But we also heard a lot about, and this group sort of started to talk about it, sort of that importance of first and last mile or the multimodal infrastructure. In some ways, just those investments have been really critical to sort of send a signal to the development folks that you really are looking to see development because you're making these public investments. But those investments are not free. Really, when it comes to financing infrastructure improvements, it really is about partnerships. This is not just about local governments going it alone and paying for those improvements. There are lots of people that are at the table that are making these investments, whether they're improvement districts or urban renewal authorities. There are a lot of people at the table thinking about how to make these infrastructure investments. And even though obviously, as I mentioned, the 50-75 kind of sucks all the energy out of the room, and we only think about that population and employment side of things, we heard very consistently that really it's thinking about how do we actually add parks and open space and cultural amenities in these places that really is becoming a challenge as well. It's hard to do density in these places without amenities, right? If you don't have a place that ultimately is a place you want to be, you're going to have difficulty attracting both population and employment to those areas. Lots of need for multimodal transportation facilities over and over and over again. 75%, so 3/4 of the centers surveyed said that, frankly, their current multimodal infrastructure needs either moderate or significant improvement. It's just not there. It's not what they need to ultimately create that environment that they're looking to create, and that really funds through DRCOG are a big part of what they do, what they tap into to make those environments successful. And the key needs, bicycle infrastructure, a lot of these last mile things that you were just talking about, that's ultimately what they are clamoring for to make these places work. We talked during the interview process about corridors. Mostly there was a lot of interest from the MetroVision Planning Advisory Committee to kind of understand how the notion of corridors work with urban centers. We have some corridors that obviously bisect or are a key piece of an urban center, but they're also oftentimes adjacent to and really have a direct influence as to how successful an urban center can be. So we really did want to kind of at least begin to have that conversation. And so during the interview process, we heard pretty consistently that ultimately we should be thinking about corridors as complementing centers, not competing with them. But just like the centers, they need significant improvement to actually make these places really transit-friendly, pedestrian-friendly, bike-friendly. They are oftentimes very auto-oriented, and it is not necessarily resulting in the type of development that people are liking or wanting to see. And people are using all sorts of strategies to actually try to improve the image and the function of those corridors that are either bisecting that center or working directly with it to create that overall area of development. So that's sort of it for the it's kind of the survey work and some of the interviews. So as I mentioned, we did have an idea exchange, I believe back in May, called Urban Centers and Not So Urban Places. I think we're sort of saddled with this term urban centers, and so people think that this only means kind of the urban core of our region. So we had folks from Centennial, Castle Rock, and Louisville come talk to the group about what they're experiencing. And kind of this is sort of the big takeaways that we had from that piece. Not surprisingly, if you were talking about urban centers or if you are talking about transit, parking is going to be about the second or third word that comes up in any conversation. It's just a huge piece. But you also have to recognize there is no perfect parking ratio. You cannot write a development code and establish a parking standard and expect it to live on forever and solve everything. You have to constantly be thinking about what are the parking needs within this region or within that center. It's really one of the things that I thought was a good note is it's important to program these places. We talk about households, we talk about jobs, but we really are kind of silent on the idea of these places as gathering places, and for these to be places you want to be. And so that really has been a successful thing that people have been pursuing. And also one of the things that we heard is that flexible design and good design is ultimately the key to density. I mean, if we really are trying to create places that can accommodate a significant amount of growth in the future, you can't lead the conversation with density. It's not about density. It's about good design. And that ultimately enables density to happen when that community is ready for it. We've talked a lot about sort of the multimodal side of things, but it was very consistent from this group that really those investments, particularly those public investments, really send a signal to the market that you are looking for a certain type of development and that you're open for business and you want to see new housing and new development within your community. And also the importance of educating all stakeholders, business owners, property owners, elected officials, residents, all need to be on the same page. We heard from Castle Rock during this that they had all this trouble downtown, just over and over. Every decision was a fight. They ended up having, a lot of meetings, something like 70, that's a big number, 70 meetings with business owners, property owners, elected officials, residents, and since then have really had no problems. They've created a regulatory framework that everybody can buy into, and overall development has gotten a lot simpler through that effort. And I didn't do this just because Ashley's here tonight as a new person, but I did want to sort of give you an example of kind of how this all kind of comes together. So this is something that Louisville talked about during that idea exchange. So this is a feasibility study that actually DRCOG helped fund to sort of look at how to actually create a connection from their downtown out to Highway 42. They have a limited number of connections there because of a railroad, so we looked at this sort of South Street underpass project, and so they were able to sort of think through what were some options that you could do to make that connection. And because of that, as well as many other things that they've been working on, such as a really innovative temporary patio program that allows dining establishments to have patio space in the summertime, they are seeing a tremendous amount of development just in the last 18 months, 3 years, in terms of folks coming in and reinvesting and ultimately in a really small town environment. And so this is really kind of how these things come together, a little bit of infrastructure investment, a little bit of planning, and hopefully you've set the stage for quite a bit of private investment. So as I mentioned, we've done a lot of analysis on our own, and so I don't bore you with all the sort of, I thought about bringing some graphs and tables, but just to kind of give you the high-level stuff here, we realized that urban centers work. They deliver on the promise of contributing to regional goals when they have a lot of things going on. They need population density. They need employment density. They need an established roadway network. They need a transit network. They need lots of things to ultimately be the places that are going to contribute to those regional goals. And we've also found that transit alone is good. You add transit to an urban center, there's a good chance you are going to see a bump in transit ridership. You're going to see a bump in bicycling and walking, and therefore a reduction in maybe some SOV trips or overall VMT. But if that's all you do, you're not going to get a whole lot of bang for your buck there. You need to be thinking about that full complement of things. We also found that urban centers on the sort of farther edges of the region, even when they have a lot of these design features, sometimes suffer from high VMT and high SOV, mostly because they aren't as connected to the rest of the region as maybe some of the places that are closer in. There are exceptions like Boulder and Longmont that have really established employment areas, but many other places do struggle with that. And the other thing that we found that I thought was really interesting is that we looked at how employees travel in urban centers and how residents travel in urban centers, and really it's the residents that ultimately are adopting behaviors more so than employees in terms of shorter commute trips, more biking and walking, all those sorts of things. And so this is not a squint test. This is just so that you can kind of see it, but I'll use a different PDF here because I think it will help you sort of see the difference. Whoops. So the key thing to look, the legend is at the very bottom. You don't have to worry about reading that, but this is percent of SOV for urban center resident workers. So our goal is 65%. So as a region, we are hoping that 65% of people commute to work by SOV and 35% by other modes. And so these areas in the brown or in the sort of the non-green are ultimately getting closer to that goal. And these are the resident workers. These are people that reside in urban centers and are commuting somewhere for work, right? So not all trips, just residents that are employed and working. Yes.
Just to interject, what time frame is this? And do you have a comparison of what it was and what it?
So this is the most current sort of modeling work. So this will be 2011, 2012 time frame. So give you an example. So this is employees of urban centers. So in almost every case, all urban centers are actually having the employees within those urban centers are experiencing at least 75% of the workers are commuting to work by single occupant vehicles. So lots of green on this map versus the residents. A lot of the residents are ultimately have more options and are actually deciding to use modes other than single occupant vehicle to get to work. And it was just an interesting observation during that process. So a little bit about kind of what we've heard from the MetroVision Planning Advisory Committee. This group was formed by the board and began meeting in January of last year to kind of work with us throughout the process. And so we asked them kind of a series of framing questions in both June and July, and I'm kind of sharing this with you tonight, obviously. And part of this was sort of affirming what urban centers are now, right? Should they remain a primary growth framework for the region? Their answer to that was yes, we should continue to do that. Should we as a region continue to prioritize investments in these areas? The answer to that was also yes. Should they be places that are highly accessible to both within the center but to the larger region as well, and promote access to opportunity, whether that's employment, services, education? And the answer to that was yes, but sort of a flag. We aren't there yet. There's still a lot of work to do on that. And then also, should these be areas where sort of the policy framework, the infrastructure investment environment comes together and ultimately helps contribute to a larger set of regional goals? And the answer to that, and their estimation was a yes as well. So some other feedback that we've heard over the last couple of months, particularly the scenario work, both back in 2009, early 2010, as well as our recent work last year, just call very clearly that urban centers are really critical to many of the goals we're trying to accomplish as a region. And so we, from a planning framework, we ought to think about interjecting as much as we can the importance of urban centers throughout MetroVision as a plan document. But we also need to be thinking about areas that are not just those centers, but areas that have a high degree of transit access or areas that are adjacent to urban centers. We did have a scenario E, which looked at not just the centers themselves, but also areas around the region that are really highly accessible from a transit perspective, and it performed very well from a scenario analysis perspective as well. So we need to be thinking not just about centers, but about those other areas that can contribute to our progress on those goals. We talked about it, as you guys just talked about it. First mile, last mile is very critical. We're really silent on that right now. We can't ignore that issue. It's very critical. We have a goal that focuses on a sheer number of jobs and housing, but we have to think about the quality of those as well. It can't just be about any job. It's got to think about the overall types of jobs and housing that are occurring within these areas. This is the first one is more of a messaging issue, but we need to be very clear in MetroVision 2040 that urban centers are local and regional priorities. I think the plan gives the impression that it is a regional priority first, and if anything, it's the opposite of that. These are local priorities first, that the regional plan is just simply recognizing. That's really what this process is. As I mentioned, we do have some communities that really do see themselves as largely built out, and so they aren't necessarily looking for more population and employment. They're looking for better amenities. They're looking for more streetscapes. They're looking for other types of things that ultimately can continue their progression as a center. We spent a lot of time last month talking about should we differentiate urban centers in terms of prioritizing funding. And we went back and forth and spent quite a bit of time on it. And really the answer was that the group came up with was no, that pretty much every type of center has some need for infrastructure investment. Those that are built out and are still looking to mature and create an environment that allows them to sustain their success, to those that are greenfield that frankly just need infrastructure to get the sort of development process going. all of those and everyone in between ultimately needs some level of investment. And they also spent a bit of time talking about, particularly the designation process being an opportunity to raise the bar so that there's even more expectations that are placed on urban centers going forward. But there was a little bit of a resistance among the group that really there are some communities that are seeing development pressure within their centers, but frankly, it's not the type of development they're hoping for. It's good that people are knocking on the door and coming to the zoning counter and beginning to talk about development, but it really is not consistent with the overall local aspirations for those areas. And this sort of comes back to the overall policy framework. We have 104 in a variety of different communities. None are going to be the same, but they should have some level of shared attributes. They should be a mix of uses. They should be multimodal. They should be more intense. They should be accessible to a diverse population so that there is opportunity available within those areas, and then they really should be gathering places not just for residents and workers, but for members of the larger community as well. So obviously we spent a lot of time with the Planning Advisory Committee also specifically talking about the 50-75 goal. Their recommendation was to keep it or some version of it, noting that there are actually other regions that are even more aggressive in terms of the share of population and employment that they expect to have within their centers. Most of the conversation during this time really did focus on the jobs piece, and I think most people recognize there are some sectors or industries that are never really going to be fully able to develop in urban centers because they have high square footage requirements. Maybe it's entirely single story. There's only so much that they can do to actually be a contributor in an urban center setting. But sort of the flip side of that is let's also recognize that primary jobs in this region are important, but they're only a piece of the overall jobs puzzle. We have always been a small business state and a small business region, and urban centers are the types of places where a lot of these small businesses end up beginning and thriving. And so ultimately, we did recognize that we are going to need a revised jobs target should the board decide to actually keep a measurable outcome. It is difficult / impossible to actually quantify and identify new jobs. It's the easiest way to talk about it, but I don't think it's actually a fair approximation or representation of what happens. Just because a job is there today when it wasn't there yesterday doesn't mean it's new to the region. It simply could have moved from some other place in the region. So we have to think about that a little bit and be a little bit more accurate in what we're talking about, what we want to measure going forward. So I'll take a quick breath. That is kind of my talking in terms of the fire hose moment. I have a few questions that I know I absolutely would love to have feedback on tonight, but clearly if there are other things that you want to talk about, let's do that as well. We're getting close to sort of starting to draft this part of the plan for board consideration, and so we don't want to go much further without checking in with this group. Should we continue the concept of a measurable outcome related to urban centers, whether you want to call it the 50-75 goal or something approximate with that. Overall, we support that. We do feel like that's important. I would say the stakeholders have also supported that, generally sort of falling on the side of, there are some messaging issues with it, and we could probably articulate it a little bit better, but it is ambitious, and if we don't really set an ambitious target, we aren't going to make a lot of progress. If this is something that this group desires or that the board desires, what types of information do you need to sort of validate that we're on track? We don't want to just sort of put something in front of you and it kind of feel like it's coming at you sort of from nowhere. We want you to have an understanding of where it came from. And I'll flip through some of the other questions as well, and then we can sort of circle back to what you might want to talk about first. Should we continue to prioritize in some way urban centers that have high capacity or high frequency transit? Overall, we think the answer to that from staff's viewpoint is yes, we should continue to do that with the comma, but let's recognize that there are other things that communities can do that ultimately are contributing to regional goals as well. They're building multimodal infrastructure. They're creating a mix of uses. They're thinking about a variety of housing options. There's lots of things that they could potentially do, even absent a transit environment or transit investment that ultimately has regional benefit. And then should we think about adding sort of the following concepts to what's already within the policy framework? You know, the idea that urban centers are a part of an overall puzzle of places that really can contribute to an environment that ultimately allows for people to have choice, that allows us as a region to achieve our goals that we've set. Should we really consider you know, adding in this idea of gathering in green spaces? And I think something that's come up pretty consistently is let's recognize the importance of partnerships within these areas in particular. They're obviously centers of attention within our communities, and so let's recognize that many people are at the table when we're making decisions and investments within these areas. And with that, we can have some discussion if you'd like.
Yes, let's. I think that slide that you have up now is really what we want to try to tackle. We only have 23 minutes left for our discussion, but sort of the big uber question about whether or not urban centers continues to make sense as kind of an organizing goal for MetroVision, and then figuring out what information we need to help set goals around that. So why don't we answer the first one, which could be an easy question to answer, which is the general question about urban centers. We just heard a lot of data about how it's still supported. It's been the orienting concept for a lot of MetroVision work. Do I hear anybody suggesting that we should change that?
I'll just
Phil.
Look to add a little bit of commentary around that. If we say we have the urban growth boundaries and we buy into that there's going to be a population increase, if we don't find ways to have residences and jobs closely aligned, which is kind of what I look at as an urban center, is where you have it's not your pure neighborhood core neighborhood community. It's going to be jobs and residences closely aligned, or more closely aligned, more likely. If we don't have that, then what we're talking about is this even spread, and it's a different idea for regional planning. The question that comes up in my mind is where we have communities that, well, for the moment, say they're built out, what's the capacity for the region to actually go through that, recognizing, are we talking about significant redevelopments and reinvestments for those identified urban centers? Are we talking about identifying, moving from 104-ish or 140, whatever the number might be, to more urban centers, and therefore we kind of hit some of our goals because we just increased the number of designations? Those are kind of the questions where I'm sitting here and I'm saying, if you're looking for the information, I want to know, what is it even more aggressive if you kind of check off those that have said, hey, we're built out, and you kind of take them off the list and say, so then what happens with the rest?
Sue, and then Jackie.
So I think we intuitively think that the urban center concept makes sense. Because if you have denser populations, then they're not as, and transportation associated with it, then people don't have to drive, et cetera, et cetera. But I think for us to know whether we should continue on that path and know that it makes sense is different than intuitively thinking that it does, which is why I say we absolutely have to come up with a concept of measuring the outcomes, because it's too easy to get caught up in the in the concept of, well, our goal is urban centers. Our goal isn't urban centers. Our goal is meeting the MetroVision goals, which are reducing carbons in the air, which are reducing VMTs, which are reducing water usage, all the stuff we saw up here earlier. And so I think it's really critical that we come up with a method of measuring how we're doing with urban centers, the 50-75, and how we're doing in achieving our goals, and then having some comparison between those two to make a really good decision on moving forward with it.
Jackie?
And I agree. I think the concept of urban centers is a good concept, but I think the 50, 75%, I appreciate the fact that you're saying it's going to require adjusting, and I think this idea that you can't identify new jobs, and how does one identify new jobs, and the struggles, did the jobs move from Denver to Greenwood Village or California to Colorado to the Denver region, and I think this 50, 75, I really would like staff to explore looking at, is there a better way to do that? And an idea that was presented by a Douglas County staff member talked about measuring the percentage of people occupying a certain percentage of land and jobs in an area of land. So the density of jobs in a space or the density of people in a space. Because I too question, along Phil's comments, what densities are we looking at in these greenfield areas if we're going to be putting in 50% of new housing there and 75% of new jobs? I mean, do they even come close to what those communities are planning in their land use plans? So yes, I like the concept of urban centers. I like the concept of locating people, houses, and jobs, in focusing that in certain areas. I think that does absolutely make sense. But I would like more exploration of the 50, 75%. And the way it was presented to me as a discussion from MVPAC was kind of like, well, we want to be able to measure it, but we didn't have any other, it was said, there was not a resounding motion of support for the 50, 75 urban center rule. It was without another option. They felt like, okay, fine, we'll stick with it. But I think we should push ourselves a little bit to come up with a better way to measure than that.
Doug and then Shakti.
I want to compliment staff on putting together an exceptional presentation here. I think your outline helped me understand this far, far more than the admittedly thin write-up that you had in the packet. Because, for example, as Phil raised his question, I found, if not the answers, the indication of the availability of answers on pages 12 and 22 of the materials. When Sue raised her comments, I found that on page 8 of the materials. When Jackie raised her comments, I found that on pages 13 and 21 of the materials. You really did do a pretty good job of anticipating what some of the issues are, and I think we need to express those issues. I don't criticize anyone for bringing it up. I think we need to express them to emphasize that they are important factors to us. But I want to also say I think you did an exceptional job at being able to anticipate a lot of those questions and provide the beginnings of a response. It may not be a complete answer, but it's the beginnings of a response, and that's what we're here to do, because the goal for this agenda item is to provide direction to staff regarding the urban centers element. So it's to give you a general outline of direction. It's not specific tasks other than the ones you've given to yourself, saying we know we need more information on X, Y, or Z. I think you've identified that. I think we have ratified some of that, and I think that no one has here said that the concept of urban centers is something that we should abandon, but rather that there is continuing support for that going forward.
Well said. Shakti and then Don and then Robin.
Well, coming from Lakewood with much appropriately celebrated Belmar, I would say that one of the great things that you talked about urban centers is that it creates a place where people want to be, and so a place where certain kinds of businesses are more able to succeed. And you talk about how it's hard to get this measurement of new businesses, but it seems to me like even if businesses are relocating to these areas, that's significant because it means, A, it's working for the businesses, and B, all of those goals around vehicle miles traveled and such still apply even if the business moved into the area. So.
Point. Don?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Don Rozier, Jefferson County. And I too want to thank you for all the work, and it's great work. A couple questions I had. We talked about, businesses moving in and all. In some cases, I appreciate, I'm going to back up, I appreciate what Douglas County did as far as people per square foot, but in some cases, it's not necessarily the number of individuals, it's the business, what they bring sometimes. In essence, we just had a new business move into Golden, or in the process of moving into Golden, of which the county provided a business personal property tax exemption or benefit to them. High tech, very expensive. They have 4 different levels of clean rooms, not a lot of people, but they produce something that no one else in the region produces. Are these stencils for computer chips and for boards. Very a phenomenal company to have in Jefferson County and Golden, but if we look at it purely because of people and not look at the volume and what they're producing and the economic driver, I think we'll get skewed numbers there too. Also, I love the discussion of urban centers, because this goes back to strategic corridors. Sorry, but I'm going to bring it up, because typically when you look at urban centers, they're defined within cities. Not always, but primarily they reside within cities. And later on in the documentation, it talks about urban centers should be destination locations. I agree. How you get from one urban center to the other urban center is up to you. You want to drive, you want to fly, you want to walk, skip, hop, jump, whatever, getting there. But typically when you look at, that's Ron was doing the skipping and the jumping. But when you look at, typically when you have one urban center and another urban center, that connector, that strategic corridor, is more often than not in the county. So we want to link these urban centers, but don't forget about the counties and that linkage, because we want to make sure everybody travels safe. We want to make sure, so those strategic corridors are very key, that we provide those linkages to making sure that the urban centers are productive and fruitful for the entire region. Thank you.
Robin, and then I'm going to insert myself.
A lot of eloquent comments, but I guess I was thinking about it a little more simply, which is that if you have too many priorities, nothing's a priority. So this is a tool for prioritization. And what I like about the urban center approach is that to the extent that they are self-selected by communities, what they do is actually give a signal that those are places where a community is likely to spend its own resources, which I think is a really great signal for us as a regional entity to be tracking and to be able to mirror. So, you know, that to me is kind of the simplicity beauty of it, which is that, hey, this is an area that's important to me and I'm pouring a lot into it, or I'm going to be prioritizing it. So when you're looking at where priorities are regionally, this is a focal point. And so I think that that's really great. And I know we've kind of bridged a little bit into your later question in terms of how to count the jobs, but to me I think that, you know, job growth within, like if you set a baseline, here are all these urban centers, and set a baseline year, and then what you want is growth from that baseline. That's perhaps a simpler way to do it than to do the net new to the region. I mean, you can always compare gross to gross then, right? So if you set a baseline and you look at the total number of jobs 10 years, 20 years later, and you compare that to the region, you can easily do a percentage and just see what the share is. So you get away from the whole idea of where the job came from. It becomes irrelevant. You're just comparing straight up percentages. So that's my solution. I don't know if there are unintended consequences, but to the counting thing. And I think Don's point on economic activity is an interesting one. You know, I don't know that you can get productivity numbers at a sub-state level. You know, we get them at the state level. you know, sales tax and use tax doesn't really quite capture it, but, you know, maybe property valuation does. I mean, the equipment that that company uses is certainly, even if you're giving them a business personal property tax exemption, I'm assuming they still have to account for it and report on it. Right. So I think, so you could look at VPP valuations in those areas to capture that. I mean, it's a number that's already reported and collected. Presumably assessors can isolate it to a geography. So that would be my way to capture Don's thing.
So I'm going to add some comments and then go to Bill. One is, I also want to commend you on this presentation because I was griping earlier about how thin the staff memo was. And I realized you just want us to come to the meetings. Yeah. I get it now. Perhaps not as prepared as we might have been, but still, this is good stuff. And I think you provide a lot of information that sort of answers the question about whether or not urban centers are beneficial to MetroVision goals. I mean, the scenario planning really bears that out, that most of our MetroVision goals, or all of them, do better when growth and housing is, jobs and housing are concentrated. I too feel like there should be a solution to measuring jobs, because I don't think it matters if they're new or if they're moving from a non-urban center. The point is, if there are more jobs in urban centers, which we have prioritized for where jobs should go, that's a good thing. So I don't know that it matters. You just have to figure out how to measure the jobs in the non-urban centers and then compare that. But that seems like a doable proposition. So I just think we should stop calling it new growth and just talk, you know, and do it that way. So I want to let Bill speak, but I also want to wrap this up and to, I think Doug put it well. I'm hearing, in general, continued support for the urban center concept. I hear some people wanting some more data, particularly around the 50-75. You've heard a couple of suggestions about ways we might better measure job growth. And then we had some other sort of creative ideas about other things that we could throw in the mix as well. Bill?
This is to Don's point, and I think it's something that needs to be added to this whole matrix and that is the type of jobs. If you look at Jefferson County, for example, they have the National Renewable Energy Lab there. The types of jobs that they're attracting are much more a higher level salary, more professional, and that's a factor that I think should be considered as we look at the development of metro centers. That it's also the types of jobs that are attracted, which have a direct relation to the overall economic measurement.
Jackie?
And I guess I completely agree with that, but how does it tie back to transportation? I mean, I guess the idea for me was the jobs and the houses being in the urban centers was to cut down on the SOV trips and the VMTs, and I think the quality of jobs and primary jobs, you know, are of the utmost importance to communities and the health of the economy and our state and our region. But if what we're doing is talking about transportation here, I don't think necessarily it matters the type of job in regards to the transportation.
Doug?
Just very briefly, I think because I would say, but we're not just looking at transportation, and that's the reason for the Economic Vitality Committee and the Housing Committee that we have also brought up to say, are those components, and I'm prejudging the results of that, and I recognize that, and I apologize for it, but to some extent I think we are looking at economic vitality. And so Don's and Bill's comments relate to that. But you're right, in the classic sense, I don't think that directly relates to transportation. But in the economic vitality sense, it does.
Kathy, and then maybe one or two other comments, and then we'll wrap this up.
So just like maybe the type of job makes some difference, but the type of housing. I mean, I think if you went through and said, and I've made a note here, so how many single-family units are there in urban centers? Probably not a lot. How many ownership units are there in urban centers in the recent, probably not a lot. So what you've said is if you want to live in an urban center, you have to have a certain lifestyle. So, and I'm on the housing committee, so we'll probably, I'm sure they'll get talked about, but if you're going to talk about it, if you have, you want to own something, You're not living there, so you're driving.
Eva, and then I'll.
I think also on the housing, what we've got to add too is the fact, is there affordable housing there? A lot of people can't afford to live in the urban centers because housing's too expensive.
Alrighty, so it feels like we're starting to put together the to-do list for the housing task force as well, which is good. And I would just add to the last the comments that I think housing and job diversity is probably important, because yes, we want quality jobs, we want our economy to be robust, and yet we still need to house workers that are working at the fast food restaurants that exist or whatever. We need to be mindful of how that all fits together, so we need to accommodate all. So I'm going to just turn to staff. I think you've heard pretty much unanimous support for continuing to use urban centers as a orienting principle. Definitely want some more data on the 50-75. We've made no decisions about that, but some ideas about how we might better measure jobs, and it would be interesting for staff to critique those and give us a sense of where that might land us. Is there anything else pressing that you need from us? And then
No, I just a few things that come to mind from the conversation. I mean, just so you know, the jobs thing, the new, that's not a hard fix. There are lots. The issue is the word new is just not accurate, right? So there are plenty of ways that we can think about doing that. And the only other thing that I would mention is that I didn't get to this slide. It's the very last slide in the presentation because I realized I was taking too much time probably. But the last slide talks about some more work program type things that have come up in our conversation about what we as DRCOG could be doing to continue to support what our local communities are prioritizing in terms of urban centers. So at your leisure, take a look at that, and we can talk about that some other time.
All righty. I think that wraps it up. Oh, Sue? And then
Just on the measurements, I want to make sure that we continue to correlate the other things with our overall goals of VMT reduction, all that kind of stuff as well.
You got that? Yep. Yeah, good point. And then Flo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to provide an update. Jennifer is out of surgery. She's in recovery and doing well.
Yay. All right. I think we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.